Warbird Tube webinar for this evening. I'm your host, Steve Buss, and we're very glad that you could join us tonight. This series is made possible by the Commemorative Air Force. You can support CAF through membership or donations. And for details on how you can further CAF's mission to educate, inspire, and honor, please visit our website at commemorativeairforce.org. Now, joining me tonight is CAF's resident historian, Brad Pilgrim. And tonight we are going to explore the 1980s. Well, at least the first part of the 1980s. Good evening, Brad, and welcome to the show.
Hi, Steve. How are you?
We're good. We're good. So here we go. The 1980s, another decade of progress for the CAF.
Well, if you've been following this series of webinars we've been doing, the history of the CAF from the beginning up until now. And by the 1980s, the CAF had gone from being, a Mustang and 2 Bearcats and a B-25, and it had grown up to where we had 20 wings and 21 squadrons in the CAF by that time. The 1980s were kind of, I mentioned at the end of the 70s that some of the good old fun things were starting to peter off a little bit, and it was starting to become more of a business, partially because of the expense of operating the airplanes and all that. And that was the case. And by the 1980s, the CAF was starting to have, I guess you would call, internal struggles with people who didn't like the rules and regulations that came along. But there was starting to be a few accidents here and there, and there were other warbird operators starting to come in that were looking better than us in certain ways with their operations. And so the CAF had to change the way they did business. And by this point, they had moved to Harlingen and everything, and the cow pasture days were over. This was the early air shows in 1963 there with the Bearcat. Go to the next slide. So this beginning of the, right when they came to Harlingen, this is essentially what the CAF was. You had your original 10 fighters that they were trying to get. Well, all these airplanes, by this point, they had started getting multiples of certain airplanes. They started looking at wanting to find extra Mustangs and, extra P-38s and all this. And they had to replace the Hellcat with a different Hellcat at this point because it had a landing accident. And go ahead and go to the next slide. The Corsair, that's the original Corsair that the CAF had. It had a belly landing in Olathe, Kansas. We'll just say that somebody was supposed to fill the gas tank up, and somebody else thought they did fill the gas tank up, and they really didn't. And the gas tank became full of air shortly after takeoff, and the airplane had to be belly landed. It ended up just sitting around the hangar in Fort Worth for years, and it went to Chance Vought down here in Dallas, and they restored it in 1980. That is when they finished the airplane and presented it back to the CAF. And Paul Thayer, who was the chairman of LTV at the time, he was a CAF in October. So next slide. Texas Raiders, the first B-17 we had, by this point in 1980, we had Sentimental Journey as well. If you look in this picture right there where the Texas flag is, it just has the bombardier nose, and then there's no cheek guns in it. If you go to the next picture, you see in 1980, they put the cheek gun mounts in. So by this point, they had started making the airplane more warbird-like, trying to get it back to its original configuration. Prior to this, really all they had done was repaint it. But now they started doing, I don't want to call it a rebuild, but just started adding little bits and pieces to it. So this picture is from like 84, 85, I can't remember, but you see the cheek guns, those were first put on in 1980. Next picture. This is the Tinkerbell. It was a C-46. We had 2 C-46s. We still have one out in SoCal wing. And the C-46s, both of them came to the CAF in the late 70s as they had been bug bombers, which it's kind of strange to think of a big fat airplane like that being used as a bug bomber, but it was. This one, the Tinkerbell, wound up in Oklahoma with the Oklahoma wing. And the next 2 pictures, you'll see what it looks like. They restored the airplane up there at Tinker Air Force Base, and it was really the first C-46 that ever operated as a warbird. And then shortly after that, China Doll, which was the other CF C-46, first was known as Humpty Dumpty, then it became China Doll. Those were the first 2 C-46s, and really the first 2 that ever operated as warbirds. All the other C-46s in the world were making their living as freighters. So by 1980, the CAF was getting into this kind of airplane. Next. This is when the Enola Gay movie was made. A lot of people have seen that. You can still find it on YouTube. The whole thing's on there. Patrick Duffy, who played Bobby Ewing off of Dallas, that's where most people know him from. Patrick Duffy played Paul Tibbets, and the airplane went out to California and was painted up as the Enola Gay. And in the movie, they drop an atomic bomb out of the front bomb bay. They actually did that. Ronnie Gardner and a couple of other guys rigged up a bomb rack in the front bomb bay of Fifi. And if any of you were at the Hall of Fame induction in 2019 when Ronnie Gardner got inducted, he talked about how he was engineering the airplane whenever he was looking through the bomb bay hatch and they opened the bomb bay doors, and the little boy atomic bomb was sitting in there wiggling back and forth in the slipstream. And he said, even though it was just a movie, he said, to me, that's where it hit home on what a big deal that was. So this was actually the third time that Fifi was painted up as the Enola Gay. And this time it was totally painted like this. In other movies and other TV shows it was only like one side was painted. One time only the nose was painted. But this was the third time that it was painted as the Enola Gay. And this is early in the show where they haven't taken the front turret off the bottom yet. But by the time it was all configured, then they pulled the nose bubble off of it and filmed the actors inside of the airplane, everything like that. And Fifi made a lot of money off of that. It was a big deal for the squadron to make that kind of money off the airplane. Next. That's when they were painting Fifi back on the nose. And this was before it left California to come home. That paint is real shiny aluminum paint, which I think was the best paint job it ever had on it, quite honestly, as far as gloss went. They painted it in the 82. It still has Paul Tibbets' plane number on the front of it, but eventually they all went back to the original Fifi colors. So next picture. This is some of the filming, and the reason I included this picture, if you see right there in the center, that's Vic Agather and Fifi Agather. And Mrs. Agather's not in a lot of pictures, but this is her and Vic standing out in California, I'm guessing, with the airplane shortly after that filming was done. And Mrs. Agather, a lot of people have told the story, she never rode in Fifi. She absolutely hated flying. Absolutely hated flying. Niels will tell you that, and John will tell you that, and the whole family will tell you she just was terrified of the idea of flying. And Niels told me one time that the airplane being named after her was one of the highlights of her life, but she wasn't going to fly in it for nothing in the world. So next picture. This is the Vulcan Bomber. In 1980, the RAF sent the Vulcan to the U.S. on a goodwill tour, and it went to several different places, and it came to Harlingen. And this is the first and only time that an Avro Vulcan landed at the Valley International Airport down there in Harlingen. It wasn't during an air show or nothing. It was just a big event. It was only the second place in Texas that a Vulcan had ever been. It had been to Carswell in Fort Worth one time, and then it came down to Harlingen one time. And I don't think it ever came back. But I think it's just kind of neat to know in 1980 the CF had a Vulcan sitting on their ramp. The Helldiver went up to Columbus, Ohio in 1980, up to the Curtiss factory where they had built the airplane. And they had a big reunion of all the people who had worked on the assembly line and all the pilots who had test flown the airplane and all this. This was an example of the CF starting to stretch out beyond air shows and do other events and stuff like that. And it was a big hit with the guys there, like the 6 main test pilots for the airplane all came out and got to see the airplane again. And everybody brought their logbooks to prove they had flown this very airplane and everything like that. And it was really the first time the Helldiver had gone anywhere on its own that wasn't an air show. And it was a massively successful thing. We still have some of the letters in the archives that people wrote to the CAF thanking them for bringing the airplane, how they hadn't seen one since 1944 or whatever. And then, as of now, that was the only flying Helldiver in the world, so it was a big deal to have it come up there. Next. This A-26 Invader right here, this is Air Show 80 when it was donated to the CAF. That is actually the one that was originally known as Panhandle's Pride in Brownfield, Texas. That is now Lady Liberty. And Lady Liberty it's a gorgeous airplane. It's the oldest flying A-26 in the world. But a lot of people don't know a lot about it because it doesn't go many places other than just kind of right around the local area. But this is the day that the airplane arrived at Harlingen, and it went back to West Texas, out to Brownfield, and that's where they restored it and flew it for several years as Panhandle's Pride. Then it became Vegas Vixen for a couple of years, and then it became Lady Liberty, which it still is today, which that's what it looks like today. Gorgeous airplane. They take very good care of that airplane. Devil Dog. The CF had Devil Dog at Harlingen for several years at this point, but it didn't belong to the CF. It belonged to 3 or 4 different members who restored the airplane, and when it was finished being restored, they donated it to the CAF. And in the 1980s when they did that. And I would wager that Devil Dog is probably the best known B-25 in the world because of the efforts of Beth Ann and her people in the Devil Dog Squadron down there in Central Texas. This is the second paint scheme, or the first paint scheme, but the second nose art on the airplane. And that's actually in Midland, I believe, but that's Jack Skipper, who was the test pilot for the airplane. That's him in the left seat. The R4D, a lot of people know that. That's the airplane that the CF, the guys in Lancaster here in Dallas have. And the airplane was donated to the CF acquired by the CF in the early 80s. But it wasn't until like 82 that they finally were able to get it out of Florida and get it back to Dallas. And when they went to pick it up, they had like an engine failure on takeoff and got the gear up, got the engine restarted, came back and landed. The engine died as they landed. And then they repaired it and cranked them both up again and tried to take off again. And the other engine died for unknown reasons. And then they brought it back and landed it. And then the other engine quit on rollout. So it took them 2 years to get the thing out. But ironically, in 82, I think it was, the reason I included it, one, this is the year that we acquired the airplane, but it went to Redbird Airport in Dallas, which is Dallas Executive now. And that's where it was originally painted in these colors, was at the paint shop that was the original, the second hangar we had at the CAF in Dallas. So I think that's kind of a neat tie-in that the airplane was painted there, and then years later, that's now headquarters for the CAF. I just thought that was kind of a neat little piece of history. This is Gunfighter. The CF acquired Gunfighter not that many years prior to this painting because it was privately owned and just kind of loaned to the CF. Well, this is the paint scheme that it had on, which in my opinion is one of the ugliest paint schemes ever put on an airplane. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that it morphed into, well, that's the second one. That's Paul Straw in the cockpit. If you go to the next picture, that's what it kind of morphed into. And that was a well-known paint scheme on it, and people liked it and everything. Well, if you go to the next picture, this is the paint scheme that it has on it today. This is what it was painted as in 1980. And they did this just because the other 2 paint schemes were not authentic. This was not authentic for that airplane, but it was authentic for this fighter group and everything. So this is the first year that Gunfighter appeared in this paint scheme. Next.
What year did CAF acquire Gunfighter? Do you remember?
I want to say like 76, 76, okay. 77, something like that. Ed Messick's owned the airplane, and then he donated half ownership to the CAF, and then Reg Ursler bought out the sponsorship for it, and then he bought out Ed's sponsorship. In fact, if you read the Warbird Digest this month, there's an interview with Reg Ursler in there. Oh. And Reg is up in his mid-80s probably at this point. And, he hadn't flown in a long time, but Reg operated this airplane as the sole sponsor for about 25 years. And a lot of people think he owned the airplane, and he didn't. And you'll see people all the time, Reg had his Mustang. No, it was always the CF's airplane after Ed Messick stepped out of the picture. But there was a lot of disagreement between the two over who owned the airplane, where the money was that was supposed to be with it, because Ed had paid a lot of money into maintenance that was supposed to be there to be used for an engine change. They had an engine failure in Harlingen, needed to change the money. That needed to change the engine. That $25,000 was not there. That was supposed to be there. Well, Ed had paid that back in another sponsorship. I've got all the letters between Reg Ursler and Ed Messick where they're fighting with each other. I mean, it got personal too. It was like, yeah, well, you're stupid. There was that kind of fighting between the two. And of course, Ed's gone now and can't defend himself. And I don't know that Reg would remember it that way, but I've got some very interesting emails or letters between the two of them over the ownership of the airplane.
That was, when you put it in perspective, it's like you just mentioned emails. It's like, this is not something that happened over 4 or 5 hours. This is something that happened over weeks where
This went on
someone
months.
write a letter.
This particular fight went on months. In fact, one of the funny things is Ed Messick's had this personalized stationery that had his face kind of as a watermark on the back of this, standing there with his fighter pilot gaze on. And one of the letters that Reg wrote back to him was he really admired his stationery. If he was as good at managing money as he was at self-promotion, he'd be a lot better. I mean, that's the kind of viciousness that went on between these two guys. And it ended up being settled out, and I think they stayed friends. But I mean, the general staff had to get involved. It was that big of a deal. 2 different chiefs and staffs. It stretched out that long. It was quite the dust up. So
that is something. Hey,
yeah.
as those of you who are watching on Facebook or go to webinar or YouTube, if you've got any questions for Brad, go ahead and type them in the comment section. And Leah Block is monitoring all of our social media channels, and she'll forward them to us, and we'll save some time at the end to kind of answer some questions if you've got any. Brad is the man who has all the interesting stories about the CAF.
This is the JU-52 that we had for years and years. It arrived used to when they did Wing Staff Conference, they used to do them twice a year. And this arrived in July of 1980. Finally, we had owned the airplane for 2 years, but because of weather and mechanical problems, they couldn't get it across the pond. So this is at the end of an 8,000-mile ferry flight from Spain to England, England to Scotland, Scotland to Greenland, Greenland to Maine, Maine to Texas. I mean, it was all kinds of trouble. One time they got fined $50 for leaking oil on the ramp at Frobisher Bay, and they got the cops detained them until they paid the $50 fine. And I mean, it was a wild trip, but they had no mechanical issues really. They got it home. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see the arrival and all that, where everyone came out to see the airplane. At this point, there was one other Ju-52 flying in the country, which the author Martin Caden owned at the time. And his is a real German one. This is a Spanish Casa 352. If you go to the next picture, you see the ferry tanks. This is how they had it loaded up to fly the thing over. And keep in mind, this thing flies at about 90 miles an hour. So 9,000 miles at 90 miles an hour, that's a long trip. So, and then the next picture this is how it was eventually painted. It was up at Michigan, the Southern Lake Michigan Squadron operated it for the entire time we owned it. It came back to headquarters, and you couldn't sell rides in it or do paratroopers out of it anymore because it was an experimental foreign-built airplane. And so after a couple of years of being up for assignment, nobody would sponsor it. Not that it wasn't a cool airplane, you just couldn't make any money with it and support it. People wouldn't pay enough for air show appearance fees and all to really keep the airplane going. So we ended up selling it. And fortunately, Jerry Yeagan has it out in Virginia, and they fly it. They take it to air shows, and it's a big part of their collection out there in Virginia Beach. This is the first B-25 we had, and this is at the kind of the end of the 1980. This is the first B-25 we had, and by this point, it was just a corroded mess. I mean, it was literally so bad that pieces were falling off of it. The Air Force Museum wanted a B-25 to be on display at San Antonio at Lackland Air Force Base, where Air Force Basic Training is. So the Air Force asked the CAF to help them find an airplane. Well, this one, we'd already taken all the parts off that were worth saving. It was hollow. The cockpit was hollow and everything like that. So we donated the airplane to the Air Force Museum, and it got trucked down to San Antonio and is on display at Lackland Air Force Base. And the interesting thing that I find, this is what it looks like today. What I find really interesting about it is the guy who accepted it on behalf of the Air Force Museum was General Metcalf, who was the head of the Air Force Museum. He's the guy who later helped the Air Force sue the CAF for the P-82 Twin Mustang. So I think it's funny that he was there, our benevolence was helping him get a B-25, and then they came and took the P-82 from us years later. But anyway, that's kind of, and one other little side story, not about that B-25, but this is the end of 1980. 1980 is when the Fifi left the boneyard at China Lake in 1971. Flew to Harlingen, was restored, flew again in 1974. From 1974 to 1979, Fifi operated with the same 4 engines she had in the desert, which were the same 4 engines she had in 1954 when she landed in the desert. and they'd had cylinders changed and all kinds of stuff. But in 1979, they changed the first of the original engines. At the end of 1980, they changed the last of the original engines. So the original bad, trashy B-29 engines stayed on Fifi from 1954, 17 years in the desert, and worked until 1980. So I just thought that was a neat place to end 1980. So this is Airshow 81. That's Tennessee Ernie Ford standing up there at the MC stand. And this 1980, 1981, and 82, Tennessee Ernie Ford, Bob Sanford Tuck, Adolph Golland, Pappy Boyington, they were all at the air show. I think Tennessee Ernie Ford was the MC at the air show for 8 years, if I recall right, at Harlingen. And there's an interview with him where he talks about he rearranges his concert schedule, his nightclub act, his fishing trips. He said, I rearrange everything around the Harlingen Air Show. He said, because it's absolutely the greatest event that there is to go to. And so he was, him and Eddie May, that's Eddie May on the right with the microphone. They were the MCs for the air show for years and years and years.
I'll just digress for a moment because I never had an opportunity to see any of those shows in Harlingen, but just can you encapsulate what that show was like compared to what a typical air show that people would see now today with Warbirds? How do those two compare?
At Harlingen, they did what was called the American Air Power Demonstration. I mean, it was a story of World War II, and it started in 1936. They would fly the Heinkel and the ME-1, the Focke-Wulf 44, and simulating the Spanish Civil War in 1936, which is where the Luftwaffe tested all of their weapons that they were going to use for World War II. And then they immediately went into the Battle of Britain. And at that time, we had all the Messerschmitts and the Spitfire, and they would fight out the Battle of Britain. And then it'd go on to Pearl Harbor, and then everything, all the Pacific battles, then the D-Day invasion, and then America trains for war, kind of like we do today. But it was nonstop, 3.5, 4 hours of the war. And I mean, the soundtracks that they did, the narration that they did, it was just like being in a war movie. It really was. There was no breaks. There was no flippy flop aerobatic planes flying. If they did at the beginning of the show or at the end of the show. There was no intermission. It was nothing but Warbirds. And it wasn't, there one year, I think it was 1982, we had 144 Warbirds there, and I mean, that's a lot of Warbirds. Wow. And that wasn't 65 T6s. That was like 14 Mustangs, 2 B-17s, a B-29, 9 B-25s, I mean, it was not an air show like you see today. It was a history lesson. There's nothing wrong with air shows like we have today, but they'll never be like they were. But one of the things we had back then that we don't have now is they used to bring 3 tanker trucks of donated gas to Harlingen and just leave it. And you could take all the gas you could carry. And for 6 years in a row, the Canadian Warplane Heritage flew all the way from Ontario, Canada, all the way to South Texas, just for the gas to come down there and fly their air shows. And I mean, people flew from the time the sun came up until the sun went down. Then they all went to the club, the Harley Officers Club, and then it started back over the next day. It was a great event. It was really, really neat to see the air shows in the 70s and 80s. They were truly history lessons.
Awesome.
This is the very beginning of 81. This is the third PBY that we had. This is the PBY 5A. And this airplane in 81 flew to Australia on a goodwill tour for the CAF. It was the first CAF airplane to ever really fly overseas. It went all the way, 9,700 miles, I think, down to Australia, stayed there like 6 or 7 months, and then flew back in 1982 and did this kind of, whole Southern Hemisphere tour. And it started, the CF already had a presence down in that end of the world, but it got a whole lot more members. Then the airplane came back and we flew it up until, I think, 89 or something like that. And then it had corrosion issues like most PBYs. This is the one that got left at Brownsville whenever the CF moved up Midland because it was just a corroded mess, missing 2 engines. And people who remember Gary Austin, who was Fifi's crew chief in the early 2000s, some people remember that Gary had a PBY fuselage in his yard in Midland. And then he built what he called the Stratolina, which is a combination of the PBY's wing with the C-97 Stratoliner front fuselage. And he did it as a joke. Well, that was the wings off of this airplane, and the fuselage off of that airplane was sitting in his property. And it ended up today, I think the fuselage, some of it went to Pima Air Museum in Arizona, and then was used as parts to finish their other PBYs, and was sold. And this airplane about 2 years ago was cut up to make those plane tags, little luggage tags and keychains. The fuselage was cut up to make into that. I can tell you that the wing struts that you see hanging down there, I sold those to a guy in California when the airplane was just reduced to wreckage. I sold those wing struts to a guy in California who was building a street racing car from the 40s that he was replicating, that he had a picture of, that this guy had built, and the frame was those tubes off of that PBY. When the plane was disassembled, unfortunately, people had cut the fittings off the end of them, so they were of no use anymore. Otherwise, I'd have never sold them, but they'd have been scrapped anyway. But we made $2,500 for the B-29 squadron by selling those. That's the airplane when it was before it went down to Australia. That airplane, that's the one we're talking about on top. The one below it is the 6A, which we'll talk about in 1984 when we get to it. But that's the only picture that I remember of those two airplanes. The one on the bottom wound up getting painted later, and we'll talk about it in a minute. But that was just kind of a neat picture of the second and third PBY that the CAF owned. This is Joe Ingle. In 1981, him and a guy named Dick Truly flew the second mission of the space shuttle, STS-2. And I included this in here because if you go to the next slide, Joe Ingle was a very early member of the CAF. That's him on the right, Lloyd Nolan on the left. And it's hard to tell, but where Lloyd's finger is pointing right there to the Saturn rocket, there's a Confederate flag in the middle of that rocket where they had claimed it for the CAF. And you can't tell it, but in the slides you can. But Joe Ingle joined, I think, in 1963. If you go to the next slide, Joe always said he wanted to be he was the X-15 pilot. He flew the X-15 3 times before he went to the space shuttle. Joe is the only living guy today who flew the X-15. He's the last guy left out of that group. But so he was a shuttle astronaut, flew X-15s, did all this other stuff. If you go to the next slide, he was the CAF's P-40 pilot for many, many, many years. He was still flying it in the mid-'80s, I think in 1985, when we took it to Las Vegas for the Gathering of Eagles. Joe Ingle flew the P-40. He also flew the P-39 and the Wildcat and the P-38, but the P-40 was his favorite airplane. So that's why I included this, was because 1982 or 1981, the CF had a member flying the space shuttle on its second mission. And this is also the year that we bought the very first authentic Japanese Zero that the CF got. This picture was taken in 1984 in Harlingen, but it wasn't at the CAF yet. But 1982 is when we first bought it. That airplane would make a webinar episode on its own, and maybe we can do that sometime. We no longer own the airplane. It's now in the Pearl Harbor Museum for reasons we'll cover some other time. But this is when we first bought the airplane. Keep in mind, this is 1981, and the picture was taken in 1984 when it was finally ready to fly, so it took that long. So, but this is the first year that we actually bought it. This was the year that Colonel Culpepper's Flying Circus was made. It's on YouTube. It's a very good show. It was filmed at Air Show 80 for the most part, but it was released in 1981. There's a long story behind this show. The BBC did it. It's a very good show. A lot of it, if you watch it, you have to keep in mind that this was at the end of the Carter administration and the end of Reagan had become president. The Iranians had taken hostages, and we didn't really stand up to them very well until Reagan became president, and suddenly he was a patriotic president and saved the hostages and all. And this wave of patriotism was going through the country and going through the CAF. And that is very evident when you watch this movie. But the BBC, in all truthfulness, they filmed it that way. They asked leading questions. They did a lot of things. It was almost like they wanted to make these guys look like right-wing wackos. It really was weird the way they filmed it. And I've got a lot of the paperwork behind it and a lot of the interview scripts and all that kind of stuff. And it did not end up the way it was supposed to be filmed. The CF was kind of deceived on what the end result was, but it actually wound up. It wasn't shown in the US for about 5 years, but it was shown on BBC all over the British territory, and then 2 years later it was shown all over France, and it gave massive publicity for the CAF. Probably the biggest thing for the CAF since Transpo 72, truthfully, other than the atomic bomb dropping in 1976 at the air show. But this was massively popular, and it still is today. It's still, but notice how it's spelled Culpeper, Culpepper. Culpeper is not spelled with 2 P's. See it there, it's Pepper. Most people spell it Pepper. We just had a rousing discussion on former Chief of Staff Doug Rosenthal's Facebook page this last week about how you spell Culpepper's name. One of the things in my collection is the rubber stamp from Harlingen that they use to stamp his signature on paper, and it has 1 P. Lloyd Nolan, who created the man, said it has 1 P. And so if you see it spelled with 2 P's, that's wrong, and that just slipped past the censor somehow. But that's why I put this picture in there.
Well, it's amazing when if you've not watched this, you need to seek it out on YouTube. But BBC has a reputation for being very fair and honest, at least today. Very level-headed and things like that. But when you do watch it, I remember the scene where the host is being outfitted in his CAF uniform, and it's just first of all, it's British subtlety, but it is very tongue-in-cheek, and you're right. They're almost to the point of making fun of the CAF, but more importantly, the whole wave of patriotism in the United States. They're really kind of sticking it to the U.S. and using the CAF to do it. But aside from that, if you watch it, there is just some incredible footage of Harlingen, of the air show, of the aircraft, the people.
Interviews with a lot of the important people in history.
Right.
To see. One of the interesting things is I've got a letter that the BBC, that the people who produced it sent to the CAF in like 1981, I think, or 82, I think it was, where they said that they went there not really knowing what to expect, and then kind of thinking, oh my gosh, here's a bunch of gun-toting crazy people. They said, but we wound up being so impressed with y'all's dedication to what you do and the seriousness with which you do it, but you still manage to have fun while you're doing it. And they said that's very unique. No one else in the world does that. So I think it started out as they kind of thought they were going to film a joke, but they wound up being really impressed with it. But if you watch it, like you say, the presentation does make you wonder just a little bit what their motive was, which is that. But it was a big thing. This was originally at the end of Transpo 72, there was a movie made called The Ghost Squadron. In 1981, they updated it. Earl Green, the man who made the first movie, they updated the movie. And this is the one that you see most of the time today whenever you see it, because Fifi wasn't flying when the first Ghost Squadron film was made. The second Ghost Squadron film, and it was just kind of weird that this came out the same year that Culpepper's Flying Circus did, but that was just by luck. When this one was made, it had footage of Fifi in it because the plane had been flying by this point. So it's a lot of the original footage, but a lot of it was added to it. If you go to the next slide, that's a man named Lowell Thomas. And Lowell Thomas was the narrator of this show. And when I was a kid, in the Blue Book, or in Dispatch, where it had the ad saying that this film was for sale, it always had that picture of Lowell Thomas. And I'm like, wow. Well, the man was a very famous broadcaster back in the 40s. Well, even before that. He's pretty much the man who brought T.E. Lawrence for Lawrence of Arabia, whose picture's behind him on the wall. He's the man who brought Lawrence of Arabia into the Western world. Nobody knew who he was till Lowell Thomas went and interviewed him. But they tried to get him, because he was a well-known correspondent and all that. They wanted to get him to do the narration of this movie. There's a long, drawn-out process, but when he found out what it was about, he did it and did it for free. Didn't charge any money or nothing. And he finished the movie sitting on the edge of his desk like this, because that's how he did his broadcast on his TV shows. Well, he died 3 weeks after this was done. So this was actually, people who know Lowell Thomas, this was the last project that Lowell Thomas ever worked on. So it's kind of neat to know who that is when you keep seeing him in the movie. Diamond Lil, this picture was taken in 1972. See, it has the hard nose on it. The executive nose that actually had a radar on it at the time. If you go to the next picture, this is 1979. This is when the CAF first acquired the actual bomber nose. Dave Talashay in Chino, California, you see his B-24 behind it. That's the one that is owned by Kermit Weeks today. Dave Talashay traded the CAF that nose in return for assistance in finding a gun nose for a P-38. Lefty Gardner told him, I'll get you a gun nose, you just let us have this. So Diamond Lil was out at Chino for the airplane, for the air show. They loaded that nose up in the airplane and brought it back to Harlingen. And if you go to the next slide, 1981, they finally got it on the airplane, rebuilt it and got it on the airplane. The CAF never did deliver the fighter nose for the P-38. Dave Talashay never did get that. And he mentioned that to me one time, that he was still owed a fighter nose. Dave's gone now, and so was everybody who was involved with the nose. But this is the year that Diamond Lil first started getting converted more like a bomber. This is the year that Yellow Rose finally made it to the CAF air show down in Harlingen. We'd owned the airplane for a few years prior to that, but they kept having mechanical issues and everything. So 1981 was the first year that Yellow Rose, which is one of the prettiest B-25s around, this was the first year that it actually made it down to air show. And that's before they put the bikini on her in that picture. This is 1981. This picture was taken in 72. You notice the TBM doesn't have a turret on it. In 1981, they took it to Arizona, to the Arizona wing. And they didn't sponsor the airplane or nothing, but they were contracted to do some work on it. And they got a turret from an old fire bomber that had been converted. If you go to the next picture, they put the turret in it, and that's the airplane that is up in the Rocky Mountain wing up in Grand Junction, Colorado. 1981 is the year that the turret was put on it. Shortly after that, that paint scheme was put on, and that's when they started really converting it back into a military airplane. And it's one of the nicest TBMs around today. And they're waiting on an engine right now. They're having overhauled, but the airplane still looks like that. And that was the P-63 that one of the ones that we still have today, this is when we first got it. We got it in 1981. It was painted in those horrible Russian markings, which were not authentic in any way, shape, or form. But if you go to the next picture, this is the airplane is repainted into that. Today it's been restored again, and it has a black spinner on it. But that's the year that we got this P-63, which at the time was the only flying P-63 that the CF had, because 191 Hotel that is down in Georgia was being restored at this point. And so that's actually the fourth P-63 that the CF owned, but was the only flyable one at the time. And we still have that one today. 1982 was the 25th year anniversary of the CF, and they called it the Silver Jubilee. And they never thought they would make it to 1982. It was, like I've said before, it was never intended to be what it wound up being. But here they are in 1982, and it was going to be this really big year. Well, there was still the remnants of inflation with President Carter and everything like that. So the early 80s were kind of lean years for the CF, and as it was with the rest of the country. And so the Silver Jubilee never quite wound up being the big thing it was supposed to be. Not like they did with the 50th anniversary or something like that. But this was going to be the theme for 1982. If you go to the next slide, there were 3 patches that were done with the 25th anniversary logo on them. And this was the one just for Air Show 82. If you go to the next slide, that was the unofficial patch that several wings had made. So the CF adopted it as an official patch. So there's only actually 3 official CF patches from 1982 commemorating the 25th year. And that was the third one, and it was kind of happened as an accident. The other 2 were the real ones. This one was an afterthought. So that's the beginning of 1982. But this time, the CF had 47 employees just at headquarters. Back then, we had an entire maintenance operation. There was 9 guys working in the maintenance hangar. They had all kind of, work line boys and everything else. They had no education department at the time, which we have now. They had very little in the way of PR, which we do much better on that today as far as personnel. The ladies in the back office all did double duty on membership and sponsors and everything. They didn't have anybody, a development director. That didn't come around until 1986, when they started literally hunting for people to donate money. At this point, we had 539 sponsors of airplanes, from 1957 to 1982. 539 people had sponsored airplanes. And I don't know what the number is today. Sponsorship used to be a bigger deal because that was the only way we could fund the airplanes. Today, there's other way to fund the airplanes. The sponsorships are still extremely, extremely important. But at this time, it was the lifeblood of this organization, this and the air shows. So if you go to the next slide, for people who are at Harlingen, this is the actual Iwo Jima flag raising. And everyone knows this picture, probably the most famous picture ever taken. What a lot of people don't know, if you go to the next slide, right down there in the bottom, you see a man standing there between the boots. That's a guy named Felix de Weldon. He's the guy who created the statue, the sculpture of the Iwo Jima flag raising that is at Arlington National Cemetery at the Marine Corps Memorial. This is the original fiberglass mold or plaster mold that he made for that, which then they did turn into the mold to make the bronze statue, which is out there today. If you go to the next slide, you can kind of see this is Rene Gagnon, who was thought to be one of the original racers. That's Felix de Weldon sculpting his face and everything. If you go to the next picture, you can see the size of it. And you see he's got the little model down there in his hands. We'll go to the next slide. People are wondering what this has to do with the CF. This is down at Harlingen at the Marine Military Academy. That is the full-size mold, the plaster model that was used for the Iwo Jima Memorial. And it came to Harlingen in 1982. It was stored originally in 1954. And it took 78 crates and 9 trucks to get this entire thing to Harlingen. And it was put together there at the Marine Corps Memorial. And part of the reason they chose that was that the CAF was right there, just right across the fence from them, and did a lot of patriotic things in the Marine Corps. And Felix de Weldon, the sculptor, wanted it to go somewhere that was fitting of what the statue represented. So there's the original, the actual statue itself up in Arlington, Washington. And then there's this one, which was the mold for that. And when it was dedicated, the CF did a big 6-ship flyover of it and everything like that. And it was a big deal. And when you pulled up to the CAF, when you came up Iwo Jima Boulevard, before you got to the CAF, that was the first thing you saw when you pulled into the airport was this memorial. So it actually has a part of CF history, but it got put there. It's still there today. It got installed in 1982, and the CF was there to help with the flyover and dedication of it.
Just to interrupt for a moment, though, but describe, the airport at Harlingen and the CAF complex, but there was another military aspect that was there at the airport as well.
Well, previously that had been Harlingen Army Airfield.
Right.
And during the war, and it was where B-26 Marauders were the primary training plane there. That's where they trained aerial gunners. And they had T-6s and Helldivers and a couple other airplanes. And a lot of a WASP, there were several WASP pilots over there that towed targets. And these guys would fly around in B-26 Marauders and shoot down these targets. So when the Air Force Base closed down and Valley International Airport was kind of created there, the city of Harlingen's like, we need to find some other thing to do here. The Marine Military Academy moved into a lot of the old base facility. And that's the reason the CF moved there in 1968 was all that facility that the CF moved into was all previous stuff left over from Harlingen Army Airfield. Like the Officers Club, which we'll talk about later, the Officers Club, that was the original Officers Club for the Air Force or for the Army Air Force. That's why it was such a great facility. I mean, it had the bar, the 28-foot long bar and all that kind of stuff. That was left over from Harlingen Army Airfield. You go up there today and all that's gone. There's a lot of the base left, but it doesn't look anything like it used to. But used to when you turn the corner, being a kid from West Texas who'd never seen anything but mesquite trees, you start going down Iwo Jima Boulevard and there's palm trees sticking up on both sides. I'd never seen a palm tree in my life till I went to Harlingen. And then you see this huge Marine Corps Memorial out there at the flag flapping in the breeze. Then you turn right and there's all these airplanes scattered out there. It was just unbelievable. The presentation there will never be beat anywhere. Deke Slayton, who was one of the original Apollo astronauts and then later went on one of the later missions. Deke Slayton was the guest speaker. He was a longtime CF member, but he was a guest speaker at the second Wing Staff Conference that year. Like I said earlier, they had 2 Wing Staff conferences, and Deke Slayton was still with NASA at the time, and he came and was the guest speaker. But I think we had I want to say 16 astronauts, early day astronauts from Apollo and the later missions, who were all CF members. And they weren't just a name only, they flew. Like Fred Hayes flew for Tora and stuff like that. You know, I mean, but Deke Slayton was the guest speaker at Wing Staff Conference. I thought that was interesting in 1982. Talking about the Officers Club. The Officers Club, when they moved to Harlingen in 1968, the club was originally in the building that was the offices, and the museum and all that was in there, and it got crowded. And in 1975, they moved further south from the bomber hangar to the building that was the original club. And 1982 was when this was unbelievably popular. This was what made Harlingen what it was in reality. And I'm not saying that because it's funny, it really was. The club at Harlingen was so popular with people because you could eat there, you could drink there, you could do whatever. They would come out, they would work on the airplanes, they would go in here and eat lunch. They would come back, work on the airplanes, they'd go in there and eat dinner. They would come back, they'd work on the airplanes, they'd go in there and have a few drinks and dance and carry on and have a good time, and go to the bachelor officers' quarters, which were in the hangar in one of the back rooms, and then they would start back over the next day and work. And that is really the focal point of everything that happened at Harlingen, was around that bar right there. But in 1982, they did a massive overhaul of that bar, and it was the real interesting thing about it is it was so successful as far as the money that it brought in, that it was starting to run afoul. The CF was starting to run afoul of some of their tax-free laws, their 501c3, because of the money made on other aspects of it. So at this point, they had to actually separate the club into its own entity that supported the CAF. And it was massively successful. And there's no telling how many hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars the club pumped in. But most of the dirty words I learned as a kid was standing on the porch. There's a swing out there, a porch swing. I'd sit on the porch swing and I'd listen to those people inside the bar because I was too young to go in. I learned a lot of dirty words that way. But it was the focal point of things at Harlingen. It really was. And it's really, the club at Midland was really nice, but it was only open during air shows and special occasions. This was open every day. I mean, this was all the time. This ran as a part of the organization. I don't know that it would even work today if we were to replicate it again. I don't think it would ever be what it was. But back then, that was the focal point of the CAF, and it was every bit as important as the airplanes as far as the survival and development, because the idea to get Fifi was hatched, not in that club, but in the original one, was hatched over the bar. Hey, let's go get a B-29. Oh, we can never do that. I bet we can. That's how it started. That 9,000-mile trip to Australia started in that club right there in 1978. Someone proposed taking a PBY to Australia. You'll never make it. Oh, I bet we will. Well, we'll get old so-and-so to pay for it. That was hatched over that bar right there. So a lot of history happened because of that bar and in that bar. 1982, the B-29 Fifi was used in that movie, The Right Stuff. And, it's a great movie. Even today, it's still one of the best movies ever made. The book was great. It was about the very first astronauts and the first test pilots and all that kind of stuff as the jet age came alive and how things were out at Edwards Air Force Base. Fifi was repainted up to be the drop ship for the X-1, and here they're painting the nose art on it. The real airplane that was the drop ship for all these X-planes was Fertile Myrtle, which is the B-29 Kermit Weeks owns. At the time, another guy named Ralph Johnson owned it, and it was supposed to be in the movie, and it had a double engine failure. And so they called the CF, said, we've got to have Fifi. We've got to have the airplane out here at Edwards, and we've got to fly it. And so they literally put it back together for maintenance, flew it out to California, and filmed it in this movie. If you go to the next slide, you can see a lot of these pictures have probably never been seen. Most people will deny that the airplane never flew with the X-1 under it. If you watch it in the movie, that's all an RC plane. But they built, you'll see in a minute, they built an X-1 to go into Bombay. You see right there in the floor, the belly of the airplane laying there beside the tires. That's the center section between the two Bombays. They had to take that out. They took the Bombay doors off. If you go to the next picture, you'll see those are the support arms that hang down that hold the X-1 steady to keep it from rocking back and forth. If you go to the next shot, you'll see that's the X-1 that they mocked up. It was a fiberglass and wooden model, and this is when they first brought it in there to test fit it. They were actually going to fly this airplane as a glider down off of Fifi. And Carter McGregor was the pilot, and Mike Vance was one of the co-pilots. And the whole crew went out there, and they asked Carter about dropping the airplane, and they said, well, he said, will it work? So they brought it in the hangar. If you go to the next picture, they took it outside. They did it inside and outside, but you see the braces down. And if you go to the next shot, you see they loaded the X-1 up in it. This is in the bomb pit that was built inside the hangar. They actually loaded the airplane in there and taxied around with it on there. And then they said, well, what are the chances that this is going to work the way y'all think? And the special effects people who built the X-1 said it's 50-50. It'll either destroy itself or it'll work. And so Carter McGregor said, that's it, we're not flying. So they never did fly the airplane, but they did taxi it around with the X-1 under it. Most people, there it is when it was right after it was getting mounted. Most people will tell you that never happened. Well, here's the pictures right here. And I've got all the paperwork where they talked about all this. You go to the next shot, that's the original pit that they loaded the original X-1 in outside, and that's what they used during the filming. That's where Chuck Yeager was loaded up in 1947. You go to the next shot, that's the X-1 and all that sitting out there, going to the next one. And that's when they're filming. This is when they're simulating here that they just came back from dropping it. That's why the airplane's not there. And that's when I got these two out of order. But if you go to the next slide, you'll see there it is as it's coming around the hangar, without the X-1 in it, like it just came back from a successful drop. In reality, it was done with an RC airplane. I forgot the guy's name that played Chuck Yeager in the movie. That's him right there. Sam something was his name, but that's his back. Sam Shepard.
I was going to say Sam Shepard. Yep.
Yeah. And then right there in the black with the black hat, that was the priest. That if you watch the movie, he's in Pancho Barnes' bar drinking beer. Every once in a while, you'll see him in the back. And then when they had a funeral, he was the guy who preaches the funeral. That's some of the actors standing around talking to him. I just thought that was a neat picture to include. And then that's Vic Agatha on the left with Chuck Yeager standing beside him. All right, next. 1982 is the year that George Bush was he's the vice president at that point. He was inducted as an honorary member of the CAF. Everybody knows he was a TBM pilot during the war and supported a lot of initiatives of the CAF. But 1982 is when he became a member. Next. It's also the year that the EOD squadron was officially formed. Of course, today you have the Tora Bomb Squad, you have Pyro guys, you have the EOD guys, the blasters. This is the actual first official formation of them was in 1982. Next. The Helldiver, a lot of people know the story behind that airplane. 1982 is the year that it had the belly landing in the field outside of Harlingen. It took off with a guy named John Hale flying it after John had been told by two different people not to fly the airplane because the engine was running really rough. And he took off and raised the gear and the engine quit and it crashed into a pasture. And it got recovered and restored by Nelson Ezel and Breckenridge, which will come in the next part. And it's still flying today, still the only flying one, but Airshow 82 is where it crashed. So next. Curtis LeMay, a lot of people know him as a famous general from World War II. He knew about the CF prior. 1982 was the first year that he ever actually came down to Harlingen to visit. If you go to the next slide, that's Carter McGregor on the left, then General LeMay, then Vic Agatha, and then Lloyd Nolan standing in front of headquarters in 1982. He was a big supporter of what we did also and was an honorary member and all that and did a lot of really neat interviews and talked about the CAF and everything like that. So it was kind of a neat thing to have him involved in back then. Next. Spirit of Waco. This is the year that she was finally dedicated and finished and painted up. At the time she was in Waco. This is now Bubba, as they call her, or Night Mission at the wing in Fort Worth, the Invader Squadron. This is what she looked like when the CF got it restored after they first bought it. Next. 1984. I got that out of order. That's 1984. That's the Snowbirds. The first time that the Canadian Snowbirds came to Harlingen to perform in an air show. And I was there that year. And that was the most impressive thing I've ever seen. And I've probably seen, because I lived in Washington for 9 years, I've probably seen the Snowbirds 40 times. I used to know them all. They're all very friendly. They're so different than the Thunderbirds. They are not arrogant. They are not nothing. They are a lot of fun, but they are the best aerobatic team I have ever seen in my life for a military show. 1984 was the first time they came to Texas. They came to Harlingen to perform for the CAF, and I don't think they've ever been back, but that was the first time that I ever saw them, and I was impressed. And everybody that knows me knows I hate jets, but I was very impressed with what those guys could do with those 9 airplanes. If you ever have the opportunity to see them, go see them. 1984, this was the other PBY from that other picture before that I showed you that had the unpainted PBY on the bottom. This is it. And this was the first year that it was painted. It belonged to the Lone Star Wing out in East Texas. In 1984, I watched it take off, and it went out to the water, and it was doing a photo mission with the T6. This airplane, the reason I include it in here is it's a sad story, but it's important to the history of the CF. They were supposed to get real close to the water and do a simulated water landing without actually touching down. Neither of pilots were water qualified pilots. Well, they were doing 105 knots, which is too fast to be landing a PBY in the water, and they inadvertently let it touch the water and didn't have the wing floats down. You see how the wing floats are retracted in that picture. You know, they lower it down so that you can land it. Well, there was 10 people in the airplane. When it hit the water, it just barely touched down in the water. It caved the nose gear doors in, which is a warning in the book that will tell you it will happen. Then caved in that back bulkhead in the nose gear well, which then flooded the airplane. The airplane flipped over upside down and cartwheeled out across Laguna Madre and just destroyed the airplane. Killed 7 people, killed 6 initially, 1 more died later. And out of the 10 that were in the airplane, 7 died. That was the first really major accident that the CAF had. And it's funny, in 1983, that was the first year that the Hold Harmless form came out and was required. And so this airplane, it started a lawsuit and everything else that impacted the CAF way up until after the move to Midland. And the reason I put this in here, I've got the pictures from the accident and all, and I don't show those to anybody. The reason I put this in here is this was kind of the, people talk about how the CAF changed when it came to Midland. This is what drove the change, the cost of this accident and what happened with this accident and the fallout from it. It was a big deal. And so it was a very sad, tragic event and preventable, unfortunately, like most accidents. But this changed the history of the CF, and that's why I put it in there. So, but that was 1984. 1984 is the year the B-26 Marauder flew for the first time. We'd had the thing since 1963. You go to the next picture, you see over the years that, you know, they tried to raise money for it, and they actively worked on the airplane for 9 years. Go to the next picture. This is one of the other pictures down there in Harlingen. Go to this next one, and that's it when it was flying. And at the time, was the only flying B-26 in the world. And of course, several years later, it was lost in an accident. But in 1984, they finally flew it for the very first time. And it was a gorgeous airplane, absolutely gorgeous airplane. People wonder where the name Carolyn came from. A guy named Ike Miller was one of the major sponsors of it. His wife, Carolyn, was a major sponsor too. And he gave them $25,000 if they would put her name on the nose. And so that's why her name was on there. Why the stars and bars were painted so hideously, I have no reason for that. But I can tell you how the name got on the airplane. This picture's in here because this is Airshow 84. That's me on the right in the white t-shirt. That t-shirt had Texas Raiders on it. And then that's my little brother on the left. That was the first time I had seen Fifi before, and people who have heard my webinars about Fifi know this story. I've seen the airplane before, but this was really the first time that I noticed it and paid attention to it. I put this picture in here because this is what started me in the CAF. And on the way home from this, I bought a bunch of magazines, and on the way home, I had the Blue Book and all that. And at 725-mile drive back to Snyder, Texas, I started reading the history of the CAF. People always ask me, how did I start being a historian and learning about it? About 10 minutes after that picture was taken is when it happened. That was October of 1984 on Saturday at about 3:30 in the afternoon. And that's what started me on where I am today in the Warbird business, as far as working in the Warbird business, but also as a CAF historian. It's all because of the people that I heard talking and the things I saw happening at Airshow 84. And I'd been to a lot of air shows before, but for whatever reason, right after that picture was taken, that's when the light switch flipped for some reason, which is why we're sitting here tonight, I guess. Wish there was a better story than that, but that's why we're here. So
That's a pretty good story.
that's just kind of how we started. That was one of the very early air shows at Harlingen. I think that was the first one in 1968. And if you look at the announcer stand today, it's got all these fancy speakers and wireless headsets and all this kind of stuff. And here's a bunch of good old boys with cowboy hats and continental ties standing up there in their gray uniforms and just no script, no nothing in the very early days. They're just talking about whatever struck their fancy. I just thought that was a neat picture to kind of show how it all started. So that's why I put it here towards the very end. Lloyd Nolan and Archie Donahue, Marine Corps ace, standing on the right side. I put this picture in here because it occurred. This picture was taken in 1983, and it occurred to me when I was looking through pictures. Lloyd Nolan, never in his wildest dreams that he imagined in 1957 we would have wound up where we were then, and he would have never in his wildest dreams imagined we'd wind up where we are today. But it's because of that man standing right there on the left, and I think it's important for people to hear that and to remember that. His vision is what got us to where we are.
Yeah, it truly is, and when, as you say, probably never in his wildest dreams did he think that the CAF would become what it has become, what it has been, for more than 60 years, and really there's just sort of that seed of a dream back in 1957 that's turned into this organization that we love today.
5 guys, 1 airplane, and a bad joke about a name.
Yeah.
Here we are all these years later.
Well, we've got a couple of questions that have come in through the chat, and I've been kind of looking at some of the comments, and folks really do enjoy the stories that you're sharing with us. A couple of trivia questions. Do you know what year what year and month Gunfighter was built?
I do not know that.
I'm thinking it was
late
44.
Yeah, I think it's a 44 model, but I don't know exactly when it was built. But like I said, if you read Warbird Digest this month, there's a really good article about a Gunfighter in there that has all that info in it.
And Larry Lumpkin, who is the current caretaker of Gunfighter, is going to join us for a webinar in just a couple of weeks. So,
Larry's a great guy.
Yeah,
he's
he is
a great guy. Outstanding Warbird dude.
This question: how difficult is it to get parts for these old Warbirds? I'm in my experience that it was probably more difficult maybe 10, 15 years ago than it is today with certain parts. I mean, there are some things that are just impossible.
It depends on the part. It really depends on the part. But one thing that I've learned in this business as someone who works on World War II airplanes for a living, there is nothing that money cannot fix. If you set your Mustang on fire out in the driveway, I can tomorrow at 5 o'clock, I can have you everything you need to put a new Mustang together on the way, because every part for the Mustang is being built or remanufactured. In England, the Spitfire is the same way. You can have a data plate and a stack of paperwork. By noon tomorrow, you can have parts to build a Spitfire. With the B-29, like the propeller blades, they're non-existent. What we have for spares, which is not a lot, but what we have for spares is all there is. Now, somewhere in the world, there's somebody with a bunch of them in their barn that you just don't know about. Fagan Fighters up in Minnesota, Air Corps Aviation up in Minnesota. They've got huge collections of parts that they've collected over the years that they sell. You pay a lot for them, but that's what it is. You can go over here to Ezel Aviation in Breckenridge, and they can build you anything you want. It's going to cost you money. But parts, it depends on the part. That sounds like a really dumb academic answer, but it depends on the part. If you're looking for the left-hand prop on a P-38 that spins the wrong direction, that's a little harder to find. The right-hand prop that's really common, that's actually quite a bit easier to find. So it purely depends on the parts.
Do you know what was the cause of the crash of the Sea Fury 121 ever established?
I don't know which Sea Fury that is offhand. If that was the one in England, maybe, I think that crashed not too long ago. The engine had a massive rod failure, connecting rod failure, broke and just destroyed the engine, and they couldn't quite make it to the airfield, and they landed in the grass. If that's the one, and I think that's the one they're talking about. That was like last year. So.
Okay. And I've saved this one for the last. This is one of your favorite questions, Brad. Was Diamond Lil originally an LB-30?
No. No. Diamond Lil was originally a B-24A being constructed for the United States Army Air Corps, one of like 26. And then, and I'm being facetious here, but it started out as a B-24A, and then the French bought the airplane contract. The French got overran by the Germans in June 20th of 1940. The British took over all of the contracts for the existing bombers that the French had purchased. Diamond Lil was one of those airplanes. The British designation for a B-24A is an LB-30B. Literally, the only difference is the paint job, the national markings, the caliber of guns, the type of bomb sight, and the type of bomb racks. I've got the pink slip, if you will, from the factory on that airplane where they took the American stuff out and put the British stuff in. So is it an LB-30? Yes, it was an LB-30. Was it originally? No. Today, it is really technically neither an LB-30 nor a B-24 because it doesn't meet the specifications for either of them. It's not totally a B-24. It's not totally an LB-30. But the important thing to remember, if you don't remember anything I ever said about the B-24, is LB-30 does not mean cargo carrying B-24. LB-30 means British designation of a B-24A. That is all it is. That's the most common question I've ever had. People say that being derogatory. It's an LB-30.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. That's like saying it's a Fortress 1 versus a B-17. It's a different name because the British don't share the same names.
There we go. Well, Brad, any final thoughts on the first part of the 80s before we wrap up tonight?
The first part of the 80s were I don't want to call them the last of the good old days, but it's the last of the time things were done the way they always were. The latter half of the 80s, when we'll talk about next time, is when things really start to change. One thing that I forgot to mention was 1984, the same time that this accident happened with the PBY and all. That's the first time that the CAF was approached by other cities with the intent of getting them to move somewhere else. So the move to Harlan or to Midland, which comes up later, that kind of the seeds were started in 1984. Prior to that, no one had ever asked them to. So the last half of the 80s is really important in getting us to where we are today. First half of the 80s got us to that point, though. So I think it's all pretty fascinating.
It is. It is. Brad, thank you for sharing your insights. And as you alluded to, in just a couple of weeks, we're going to do the second half of the 1980s, and we'll see that transition, and we'll look forward to that. Thank you again for joining us for our Warbird Tube webinar. If there's a topic or an airplane or a personality you think we should talk about, just drop Leah Block a note at media@cafhq.org. Again, thanks to Brad Pilgrim, our resident historian, for sharing his thoughts this evening, and we'll look forward to seeing you again next time on the CAF Warbird Tube webinar. I'm Steve Buss. Have a good night.